Welcome to Carey Open, a podcast where we open a window into the world of Carey Baptist College.
Well, a history of Carey in 6 locations. I've already had someone challenge me about this. And I can see some of you going, 6? The most I can come up with is 5. Poor old Martin, he was a good enough sort of bloke in his day, but the old boy's obviously slipping. Well, I can assure you that, be that as it may, this is a deliberate use of the number 6, because there is an additional location of the college which I think we need to acknowledge, and it comes right at the start. So we are going to do a survey of the last 100 years, not to provide a comprehensive history in any sense, and if you're a staff member and you don't see your picture up on the screen, I apologise to you. If you're a student and you don't see your picture on the screen, I apologise to you. If you think that there is something that should have been in it, well, you can do the next one. And if there's more detail you want, then there's a very good book able to be found in bins outside Christian bookshops up and down the country. Carey, an unforgiving story. Oh, I'm sorry. An unfolding story. We shall refer to that. We go right back to the 1880s and 90s when the denomination was facing the problem of problem ministers. Now, one might say that hasn't changed, sufficiently anyway, but nonetheless, this was a particular issue for the early church in New Zealand, because people were coming out already trained in ministry, but trained usually in Britain, and they found conditions here and the state of the church here were very different from what they had anticipated would be the case. And so there was a huge churn of people who came for a short time and moved on to another place. They often go, and I'm through my life been associated with what's now the Darfield Baptist Church, and as all my students know, Darfield is the centre of the universe. So people would come there thinking that the Greendale Church, as it was then, a long-established church, would be one somewhat familiar to them from the British models, but it wasn't. And they would find that the conditions were primitive, there were hardly any roads, and there was certainly no train connections in most of these places. So they would move on very quickly, and the need arose in people's minds that we need to train our own people who are familiar with the setting and understand the New Zealand conditions. So there became a desire to come up with a local solution. And so at the 1887 Assembly, Alfred North, pictured there, J.J. North's father, moved that provision be made for assisting students in our ministry and directing their studies. Now, this was not a college, but it was a location, and the conditions were fairly strong. Each student to be dealt with and guided according to their own needs, but the location of each student to be determined by the committee, and also the course of study to be pursued by them. And academic study at the time was done through Knox College, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. Kevin Ward's just pointed out to me, so that's a good connection. The picture there is John Farquharson Jones, who was the first student in the scheme, I think great-grandfather of Chris Finlay, certainly an ancestor of Chris Finlay. So site number 1, and a site that I argue has been a continuous site for the college, has been the churches of New Zealand. The churches are part, and always have been part, of the college's story. At this time, they were a fundamental location for the students, and of course for many of our students now, that's now the case again. They don't come to a college, a college comes to them in their churches. And it's one of the important themes of this survey that the connection to the churches is fundamental to the success and the waning of the success at times of the college. But students were very much owned by the committee. They were located where they were directed to be located. They were placed after negotiation with the committee, that is on graduation. So the committee would negotiate with the church and give some notice to the student as to where they were going. So it was very much a controlled, confined, dictated to environment. Status and exam results were published in the New Zealand Baptist, and this happened for quite a long time. So We know from that J.J. North headed the Hebrew class at Knox in 1894, that Mr. Shiner was very weak in arithmetic, and that Eric Evans averaged 79.4% in his course in 1911. The Privacy Act obviously had not come in. And those of you who had been at university in the 1950s and 60s in New Zealand would know that your results were put up in public there too, published in the local newspaper. By 1900, it was quite evident that the scheme was capable only of sustaining 3 or 4 students at a time. It was quite expensive. They'd set aside £65 per year per student. It's time we upped that amount. The £65 per student per year actually was quite a lot of money in the 1880s and 90s, and so there was a recognition that resourcing needed to come. But the problems were the students often came with poor educational backgrounds, there was a lack of qualified supervisors, and largely a Dunedin location would be required for the study part. Now, we are used to their discussion, do I have to go to Auckland? Well, then Dunedin was the primary city in the country, and so that was the place where Knox was, and that was the place you had to go if you wanted to do your study, and people resisted that, as they have resisted coming to Auckland at times too. And then what about home missionaries, those who weren't trained to be recognised pastors, but nonetheless could take charge of congregations and have a recognition by the denomination as home missionaries? Are we going to train them? And it's at this time where we can note some persistent themes which we'll see right through the whole of this survey, that there is, in general, a resistance to academic learning in our churches, a regionalism which needs to be dealt with at each generation, a resourcing issue, and a challenge of ramification, that is the scattering of focus. How many things can we do as a college or a training committee to meet the need for training in our churches? And as early as the early 1900s, there was a desire for a new program specifically for home missionaries. So the denomination designed its own curriculum, and this was it. First year's books to read and to be examined on. Second year, studies in theology prominent in it. Third year, Butler's Analogy of Religion. If any of you have read Butler's Analogy of Religion, you'll see why there was a resistance to academic learning. But this created a number of challenges because everyone wanted a tailor-made course. And it's a country that was scattered, transport wasn't easy. For a small country, the problem of regionalism has been an issue throughout New Zealand's history, and it's real, isn't it? Because 2 islands, crossing between those islands has always been tricky and mountainous and hard to get across distance. So there's been a resistance to things which you have to travel for. But what we encounter early is, in a case study, is the curious case of Oswald McHattie. Now, some of you know that name, and I'll come to that. Oswald McHattie bumped along a rather rocky path in the college for some years. In 1906, in August, he was in Gisborne and he sought advice about a course of reading for study. The following year, he indicated he would eventually seek a full studentship, but would in the interim take up the home mission job. After a series of communications, quote, he notified that he was now working at Otahu and Richmond in Auckland, and he was advised to begin the newly standardised home missionary course. Now, McHattie appears to have wanted additional courses arranged specifically for him, and this was declined. In 1908, he tried again, this time seeking logic and ethics to be added. He was asked to arrange these himself through the university. Well, now it was McHattie's turn to turn down the suggestion. And so during 1909, he advised he would withdraw from the course and seek entry to Regent's Park College in London. He spent 1911 in Britain, but reappeared in the home mission course in 1916, this time in Gore. Unsatisfactory exam results led to his case being, quote, carefully and earnestly considered, and it was decided that he take further exams the next year. Now, that would delay his application for ministerial status, but was required in the hope that the discipline, quote, of concentrated study and steady application would strengthen his undoubted ability and energy in other directions. McHattie agreed to this plan and finally passed from the Student Committee's supervision in 1917, 11 years after first entering its books. And those of you familiar with the history of the denomination will know that Oswald McHattie surfaced again in the 1930s from the Napier Church and was the prime mover in a very sensational court case against the denomination for removing him from the ministerial list. Story is told elsewhere in a book you can also find in the remainder boxes outside Christian bookshops. More detail about both courses can be found in this, the Carey, the Unending Story. But war intervenes in the early period of the 20th century, and the committee found itself unable to apply any consistency to home mission training. Every meeting of the committee was forced to consider various applications for waiver or variation of parts of the set program. Special circumstances such as return from war service, age or marital status, or just plain refusal to submit to the discipline of the course made any claims to uniformity of training standards untenable. In 1918, the committee asked its very first graduate, John Farquharson Jones, who'd gone on to postgraduate study in the United States in the interim, to act as overall convener for the home mission course. His plan was to supervise all the students by correspondence, but a year later, he resigned in frustration. His charges, he said, for one reason or another, had just not taken up the coursework assigned to them. And this became the challenge which the college was going to face constantly. How do you reach these students who want a course designed for themselves, but who are in the regions and are not in one place to have regular contact? Well, eventually, the situation of both plans, the ministerial course, which was still limping along in association with Knox College, and the home missions course, the issue was resolved through the formation of two colleges, not just one, two colleges. And of course, the key people in this were Joseph Kemp and J.J. North. By 1920, it was becoming obvious that there was change needed. The underlying issues were broader than the individual circumstances of the students. Perhaps the most fundamental factor was a shift in the denomination's centre of gravity. In 1887, the North Island had only 40% of total Baptist membership. By 1920, the balance had shifted so that some 55% were in the North, and power was shifting as well. Alfred North's dominant influence had faded. He had left Dunedin for a brief pastorate in Calcutta in India in 1900, and when he returned in 1902, it was to positions in Auckland. His equally influential son, J.J. North, was in Wellington from 1904 to 14 and then Christchurch. Joseph Kemp arrived in Auckland in 1920 and immediately established an influential presence at the Auckland Tabernacle. And in 1922, he was the prime mover behind forming the Bible Training Institute, which became the Bible College of New Zealand, which became Laidlaw College, which, although not intended as a college for training ministers, nevertheless produced a new evangelical location for biblical studies. And those who were interested in the home missions type training tended to gravitate towards BTI. But in 1926, it was decided that it was time for a college to be formed for the Baptists. And it was resolved at the Assembly in 1924 that it is desirable that a Baptist college should be established in the Dominion at the earliest possible date, that the proposed college be established in Auckland, that the trustees of the Auckland Tabernacle be approached as to the possibility of the facilities of the Tabernacle being made available meanwhile for the benefit of the students, and that the Reverend J.J. North be approached with a view to his appointment as the first principal of the college. Now, it's important to note that this was the beginning of the second site of the college. So the second site number 2, is the Auckland Baptist Tabernacle, and that's not a coincidence that the tabernacle was chosen, because Kemp was massively involved in the whole process. That resolution and J.J. North being appointed first principal, both were moved by Joseph Kemp. Now, Joseph Kemp clearly saw the need for a denominational seminary for training ministers, specifically for the churches, senior pastors, and wanted to offer his best wishes to whoever took it on, and willingly proposed that J.J. North should be the one. Now, they weren't the obvious pair to put together, but the misgivings of some, like Alfred North himself, who wrote to J.J. North in October 24, said that if you do link up with Kemp, it will be necessary that the lines of cooperation be most strictly defined. The element of control or direction must be excluded. That was a caution from North's end. There was a caution also from Kemp's end. I would not have you think for a moment that all our office bearers, that is the tabernacle office bearers, are overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the idea. Some of them see rocks ahead, while others are keen for the college. In the event of your coming to Auckland, I am sure that whenever opportunity offered, we shall be able to work together harmoniously. And that's the case, actually. The myth has arisen in some understandings of our history that there was a contest and a conflict between North and Kemp, but that is way overstated. In fact, it's probably just wrong. Kemp was a fundamentalist, self-identified, and very proudly so, very conservative, but he was of the era where that conservatism saw division as something to be sad about rather than to be celebrated, and he expressed a generous fundamentalism which had space for people like J.J. North because of J.J. North's clear commitment to evangelism and to following Jesus Christ. So the two of them actually got on remarkably well. And in the end of Kemp's life, which took place too early, J.J. North became the person selected to preach the sermon at his funeral. But the college starts in the Tabernacle, in its second site, in 1926. Eric Batt said this of the experience of being at the college at the time. Our college premises at the Tab were enough for the simple purposes of lectures given and received, but it was soon evident that we were missing much by not living in. Some of our students were in digs, others came from our Auckland homes. There was little opportunity for that community life which means so much in college days. So it was a challenging and clearly an interim arrangement, and no one expected that it would stay that way for a long time, but it began the college. And of course J.J. North himself was the dominant character really in the denomination in the first half of the 20th century, and he made no bones about what he thought the college should be like. The new college must be Baptist to the core because it must be Christian to the core. We want to make men conversant with the great things of the faith, and we want that faith in its whole extent applied to the whole life of the whole man and to the whole community, with windows open to all the light that comes from every quarter. We want to see our college fulfill its mission. Now, those words were fighting words in the 1920s, fighting Baptist versus everybody else, which was very much a J.J. North theme, but also a little bit of a signal to the more conservative wing that we're going to look at all branches of knowledge and welcome them all. And if you see a glimpse of the books that were in J.J. North's library, then you get a very strong sense that he was interested in economics, he was interested in politics and in science. He brought all these things to bear. He wasn't just a theologian. He was, according to Ewan Simpson, a tremendous reader. We knew perfectly well it was very difficult to quote a book that he had not read or did not know about. However, if a student did discover some new book that was worth attention, he ought not to suggest that this was a book he ought to read. The proper technique was to drop the book on his desk and say, "I'd like to know what you think about this, Dr. North." In the experience of all students from those days forward, I'm sure lecturers were much more humble and easy to deal with. But the college wasn't going to stay at the Tabernacle. It was always going to find another site, and so site number 3 is the Mount Hobson site from 1928 to 1954, presented to the denomination by 7 men animated by a common desire for service. This is up around this college site now, this very thing, who believe that the college will fill one of the greatest needs of today. They give it to the church of tomorrow in the name and for the sake of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's a pretty imposing building, and it became a site for people to live with the principle. And this is the experience of training which was most dominant for this phase of the college's life. You lived in with the principle, you became the family of the principle, and you drew from the vibe the principal would give you, in that case J.J. North. Activities included outside the classroom ones and inside the classroom ones. But these persistent themes which I've mentioned would not be avoided. There was still a resistance to academic learning. J.J. North himself was suspicious of degree structures and resisted bringing in formal degree structures or qualifications. The regionalism still presented problems. Resourcing would be a constant issue. Ramification would be less of an issue right at this point, although the presence of Thelma Gandhi in that first photo meant that this was a place where a lot of the missionaries still trained. So are we training for people in pastorates in New Zealand, or are we training for people on the mission field? And the big one of resonance with the churches immediately seems to have raised its head, because North was accused of being an outright modernist. Now, that's not really fair to North. He wouldn't really call himself a modernist. Someone like J.K. Archer did call himself a modernist, and therefore what we might call liberal now, or dangerously heretical. But Kemp at the 1927 Assembly, and this is an example of the relationship between the two men and how they understood each other, Kemp made a speech which stirred the conference very deeply. He resented very deeply aspersions that had been made against the soundness of Principal North. He declared that if North was a modernist, so in the same sense was he. He did not always agree in details with his friend, but they stood together for the great evangelical verities, and he would not hesitate to place anyone for whom he cared under the principle for theological training. This was a good relationship. However, in the churches, there was still a suspicion, and when Asen Clifford announced that he intended to go to train in the early 30s at the college, a friend wrote to him saying this: "I can imagine you getting so much on fire." What he was doing was suggesting that Asen Clifford come with him to an open air run by the BTI. "I can imagine you at that event getting so much on fire that you may even find that your place is in the BTI instead of the Bible-banging college." Bible banging means bashing in a critical way the college, obviously, in this context. Instead of the Bible-banging college being the Baptist college, I say, come out from among them. And that applies not only to churches where modernists preside, but also to all places where they have any authority at all. So the suspicion that the college was not resonating with the denomination and the churches was present then, and has remained a challenge for the college through its history. The college was open to some quite challenging things. In the 1930s was the time of the Great Depression. Asen Clifford, being who he was, decided to take on a form of social ministry and outreach, and he recounts this in his memoirs, that for a summer we slept on old mattresses on the floor, put on old togs when mixing with the locals. There was a quick change for dress when I had to dash off to some Ponsonby responsibility. We contemplated spending a night in a doss house for a shilling a night, but were advised not to do so for fear of getting bedbugs, infection, or being propositioned by prostitutes who plied their trade in many such dens. That might have been a problem for the residents of the college with the denomination. JJ wasn't all that comfortable with this approach to summer ministry, but put up with it, and people like Asen Clifford were prepared to take it on. But this was life as young men, mostly, living with the principal as a father figure, living with his wife as a mother figure, living as part of the family of this now reasonably elderly couple. But it didn't mean that they didn't get up to some sort of hijinks amongst themselves, and most prominent amongst that was the Gorgonzola. The Gorgonzola was a foul-smelling, foul-tasting drink with laxative properties that new students were forced to imbibe, and known as Spurgeon's blood. This is Clifford again, about his experience of the Gorgonzola as a new student. About a week before the event, we were warned in writing to attend on a given evening in the washhouse. We hatched a plan to divert our tormentors. On the day of the event, we secretly raided the wardrobes of the other students, that is, the tormenting students, for their best clothes. The tormentors had prepared themselves with buckets of water, great handfuls of grease, tar and nugget, and there was no way they could wash their hands before divesting us of their precious clothing, layer by layer. By the time they had laboriously reached our bare skin, their garments were much the worse for wear. The agony of our backs, forced to lie on scoria scattered on the concrete floor, and the drinking of the vile-tasting red fluid called Spurgeon's blood was somewhat compensated. But family life, as in being part of the college family, was very still the fundamental formational dynamic. W.N. Flett wrote this in the College magazine in 1945. Those off-duty moments, to my mind, were the richest in the college. Many an impression gained then in the warm atmosphere and cosy room with Mrs. North dispensing coffee has lingered, while others of the lecture rooms have been, oh shame, forgotten. Now hold that image, because by 1946, although the college had lingered through and kept open through World War II, unlike St John's, for instance, which closed during World War II, the North era was clearly coming to an end. J.J. North probably should have and would have retired earlier, but kept on through the war. And Luke Jenkins becomes the principal in 1946. Luke Jenkins was 37, half the age of J.J. North at the time. Now, the Jenkins principalship ended badly. It ended in rather dramatic fashion, in fact, at the 1952 Assembly. And I had the privilege to interview Margaret, the daughter, about that experience. And the effect on the family of that experience was quite profound. And for Mr. and Mrs. Reverend and Mrs. Jenkins, the experience was deeply distressing. Why did it happen? Well, personalities were clearly a factor. Although not sufficient on their own, nobody appreciated the different expectations of the parties. The committee failed the Jenkins on the issue of accommodation. And there was a basic lack of imagination on this question. To expect that a house the size of the college might happily contain a young family when before it had been an elderly couple plus students was really a mistake. There were, by the late 1940s, a potential for as many as 17 students when the covenant with the Smeaton estate had been there'd be no more than 11, plus a family. The committee were working on assumptions generated before the war. New Zealand was changing, so were the students and so were the churches. And this was certainly the case in theological positions. The more sharply defined evangelicalism that was now becoming stronger, and the differentiation between liberal and modernist and conservative and evangelical on the other hand was becoming sharper, deeper, more passionate, was gaining strength among students and churches alike. Jenkins arrived from outside without the established mana of J.J. North at the age of 37. His mission was to gain trust, and it was always going to be a very hard mission. Opposition had begun before he came and was easily fuelled by rumour and suspicion. His approach to life was too severe, but not significantly out of step with other institutions, even in New Zealand. Anyone who trained as a nurse in the 1940s, as a teacher, or for that matter at the BTI, would have encountered similar strictness and control. That it did not work at the Baptist College undoubtedly reflects Jenkins' uncompromising vision, but also the contrast with North's regime and the relational dynamic of a small denomination and the special circumstances of those students. Now, one of those students is with us. Don Hopkins was there at the end of the Jenkins regime. Don, you told me just before that you had to sleep on the veranda of the college. Now, why was that?
Oh, well, students with me, when I went in at 1949, some were returned from overseas. Norman Winslade was one of them, and he'd been in prisoner of war camp. And in my first months anyway, he was not able to be at college. And so I had his bed to sleep in the middle up room. But then he got well enough to come and go along to the chemist's every day or what he needed to. And there was no room for me, so there was a bed put on the outside veranda, partly glassed in. Wonderful view of everything.
A vista view, Lou.
But I had to go through a bedroom to get to it. But anyway, that's what I did.
And you had meals with the family, the Jenkins family?
Oh, yes. That still was the same. All of the meals in the sort of middle room on the level on the second floor, and that's where we held communion and that sort of thing.
Such as in that film. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don. A review of the college accommodation at that time pointed out that it was just impossible to imagine that you could carry on that level of housing and maintain a college for people who are now older men who'd experienced war and really had come back into a new world and expecting new things, and the old model no longer worked, and it was really too much to ask the Jenkins family to continue that model. Now, there were issues on both sides here, but it was not all one way in that particular failure. So it became obvious that a new site was going to be required. So Victoria Avenue becomes the fourth site of the college in 1954, and Ted and Gwen Roberts-Thompson arrive in 1953. A very different couple, a very different style of ministry from Luke Jenkins, Australian. They were loved despite that. And the 1950s, which were a golden time for the New Zealand churches, became really a very good time for the college as well. It started new initiatives, deaconess courses, and so on, and was very much in resonance with the denomination. The Victoria Avenue site, another imposing house, but it was really not imagined that students were going to live in with the principal anymore. The contract that was signed, the call document that's sent to Ted Roberts-Thompson suggested that would be the case, but no one really imagined that was going to happen, because almost immediately student accommodation was being built separate from the principal's house. North Wing in 1954, the Driver Wing in 1959, which required the raising of very large amounts of money from the denomination, which readily came in, because the denomination felt it was on a roll at this time, and that the college was its place, and they felt good about it. After the trauma of 1952, and I've spoken to people who were at that assembly in Dunedin when Luke Jenkins did his dramatic resignation, and they found it quite a traumatic event. Slammed the door as he left, and with a slam that rang through the centuries, rang around the world. Now, the 1950s were a moment in time, and I'll give you that, Barry. You tell us what life was like at the college when you were there. Barry,
yeah, sure. It was a great time, as you've said already, because there was a vibrancy going on in our churches, and we were part of that. When we went back to our churches for assignments, we were going back to churches that were full of young people and full of Sunday school kids. The churches were going well. But my great memory of my time of training was Roberts-Thompson's desire for the ecumenical side of things to develop more and more. And in those days, churches really cooperated well, and we wanted to be part of that. We were in the National Council of Churches, we were in the World Council of Churches. Some people grumbled about that, but there was this feeling that together the churches could do well for the kingdom of God, and we were very pleased to be part of that. Sadly, it didn't last. And just one other thing, it was the start of the charismatic movement. And some of the lecturers were not too happy, and we smuggled Neville Winger into a meeting at night, and Asen Clifford got hold of it, and it's surprising that I'm here today.
So maybe not everything's changed. 1960s, Ted Roberts-Thompson concluded, surprisingly, at the end of 1950s. Things were going very well at the college, and no one really expected he would resign. He went to become principal of the College of the New South Wales Baptists in Sydney, and met the same fate as Luke Jenkins had here. Interesting enough, he would have looked back on that period as a complete failure. And his principalship there ended badly for similar reasons, actually. His approach, he just completed a large PhD thesis on ecumenism and reaching out to other churches, as Barry mentioned, the importance of that, but that was not where the New South Wales Baptists were at the time. And in my experience of 4 years living amongst the New South Wales Baptists, they're probably still not, actually. But the 60s then proceeds, and Asen Clifford becomes principal. But it's no longer a single men's club. And this is the challenge which the college has to face, but doesn't face it particularly well initially. And so we've got two people here, Lois and Jim, who were married when they arrived to the college. Now, what was your experience of being married students at the college?
Yeah, I think we were one of the first ones to come in as married students. So the college arranged for us where to stay. There was a beautiful house on the other side of Victoria Avenue. I'm trying to remember their names. They're related to someone on the board. So we had a bed sitter over there. And then after that, the college had a property in Arnie Crescent. which is one of the most expensive streets in Auckland, and we had the top floor there, and the Laurie and Shona guy and the Osborns were there too, so I can't remember paying any rent for it.
While we were at college, we were looking at an adoption process, and the solicitor, I remember him asking us questions. Do you have employment? No. Do you have any assets? No. Do you have any income? No. And I remember he scratched his head and said, I've never done one like this before. But yeah, no, it's good being part of the whole scene.
For the wife of a student, was there anything at the college for you?
Yeah, the lunches. Well, I was teaching a lot of the time, so couldn't always be there. But there were things that we did combine in with. There was no training for us or anything. They just accepted who we were.
I once applied for a credit card when I was a student at college with the ASB Bank, and I got back a letter which left absolutely no doubt as to why I'd been declined, because it wasn't addressed to Dear Martin Sutherland, it was addressed to insufficient assets, no history, no funds. I took it along to them, and they were so embarrassed about it, what they'd revealed in their letter, that they gave me the card after that. Asen Clifford writes in 1970, after 10 years as principal, that the increasing proportion of married men makes a community spirit more difficult to capture. Students are no longer here all the week. Extracurricular activities become a Cinderella. Special thought is required to maintain community worship and group prayer. And this is the kicker. In the old days, it used to be said that college life is good for a man, he gets the corners knocked off. Today, unless this abrasive process is already done or is done by his wife, a man may go out into the ministry, corners and all. Now, Laurie, you arrived in a slightly different way at the college site from other people. Tell us about that and your experience of college then as a student.
Okay, first of all, I first came to the college in 1965. The college took in about 6 boarders who were basically university students. I had actually put my name down to go to the Baptist Youth Hostel alongside the university, but they mucked up the application and forgot it. So by the time I inquired, it was full, and my father put my name down for the Baptist College, and I was dismayed. I didn't want to spend time with these holy joes. And I decided I would only stay for 1 year. I stayed for 3. I was in room 11 alongside Derek Christensen in room 9 and Keith Clark in room 13, and across the way was Wally Hayward in room 8. Students, when there was work going on at the college for the part of the hijinks, put a concrete mixer in Wally Hayward's room. Wally Hayward put it out into the corridor pretty much straight across from my room, and at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night, the concrete mixer went off. A terrible rumble, rumble, rumble in the north wing. And students tried to turn it off. He'd got it plugged into his own room, and he'd locked the door. So they had a skeleton key to get into his room, but he'd wise to that, and he'd put books between his door handle and the bathroom towel rail, and so they couldn't get in. Eventually, they solved the problem by removing the fuse wire. And then 2 hours later, rumble, rumble, and Wally had got it going again. He thought about this, and he had some spare fuse wire. So that highlights what for me was very significant in the college in the 60s. It was for me a tremendous sense of community, which would involve suppers at night, table tennis. Tennis, I remember playing one Sunday afternoon, and Asen Clifford, to my amazement, I couldn't understand it, he gave us a blast. I think we'd been desecrating the Sabbath by playing tennis. And then I do remember I had some questions about prayer, and I remember with about 4 or 5 of the theological students in a room at night just talking together about prayer and that sort of thing. So that was the first coming.
And the second coming?
The second coming, I think I really appreciated theology with Ace and Clifford, the undergirding underneath all of the biblical texts. And I also appreciated the counselling classes, and I especially appreciated the summer pastorates. So that meant that we weren't green when we went out into a ministry. I think I probably went into Carey with about 4 sermons I preached, and I left with about 100.
Thank you, Laurie. Now, what this chart shows is that the number of students, as the 70s came along and married accommodation did become available, the student body dramatically shifted from single men to married students. And amongst those people who came in the 1970s was Susan Osborne. Where are you, Susan? Not married at the time, but here we are.
Well, actually, I don't think Carey's changed much, because the second person I met at Carey, I was hosed, he was doing the garden and I was sunbathing on the balcony, I married as well. so yeah. Well, I was actually the only girl living in 1971. I went to college the same year as Laurie. And so that was actually quite nice, having all those young men. And I didn't look at any of the married ones like a good Baptist, but no. So that was quite a good choice. Anyway, John won the dip, and that's it. Yeah.
Were you welcomed as
Well, you know, throughout my life, I've never let being a female kind of influence what I did and what I said, and so, yeah, no, so no, oh dear, so I didn't feel as though I was at any disadvantage or advantage, actually, no. And then, fortunately, my next 2 years, there were more women there, so things were a bit more balanced. But it's all right, I had my man by then.
You got in early. The 70s then become a period of, 70s and then into the 80s and 90s become a period of change, because you're no longer having a village even. It becomes a marketplace where everyone's doing different things. There's an increasing diversity of call, of gifting, of goals and programs. ACTI comes along in 1985, MCD degrees in 1988, University of Auckland degrees in 1990, Church Growth School starts missionary training, there's a social work course earlier than that, missional training, pressure from the South Island for a location there. All of these things are part of these themes of a resistance to purely academic learning. The regionalism is still there, resourcing becomes an issue, scattering of focus becomes a risk, and resonance with the churches still becomes a question, because you've got the charismatic movement in full force in this period, and a strong desire for a different approach to training ministers. What's the criteria for ministers? Is it learning? Is it ability to teach? Or is it being in tune with the Spirit and being able to speak in tongues? I mean, this is what the tensions were. So that the world was changing. And then in 1989, there was a 5th site proposed that never happened. But it's interesting that this site, which was going to be in Ellerslie, about a kilometre in a direct line from here, was still largely based on a residential model. But the residential model had itself become no longer tenable. But God and the stock market crash intervened, and that didn't happen. However, back in the 1980s, life was still residential on site and mostly families. Neil and Barbara, what was life like for you guys? Highs and lows of your period?
Well, we were married when we got there with 3 kids, so we already had each other. On-site community life was great, some of the highs and lows. That had the positive side, and it had the challenges as well. Families together, different models of parenting. But it was very inclusive. We had lots of family picnics and games out on the grassed area. There was a creche option, so for preschoolers, if spouses were wanting to do study as well. The spouses, well, it was wives actually, I don't know that there were any men when we were there, doing monthly, I think it was monthly evening times together, where you were sort of discovering what it was to be a pastor's wife, which I didn't want to be, but...
I was part of that year group that was stuck in the middle. When I went to school to play sport and to eat my lunch, and I enjoyed that. Coming to college was a very different scene for me, and I did have a sense of call to be there, but Terry Feller introduced me to Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, must I endure this forever?" And I made it through. But part of the scenario was that I was in that year group that studied for a whole year, really slaving away, and only to be told, well, what you've done was worth nothing because we're changing to an MCD model next year, so you'll have to start again. It was great.
Good for the soul. Good for the soul. Well, thank you. And I'm glad that one of the lows you talked about was not living above us.
I was just about to add that, Martin. Being on site and having a sense of community had its advantages, and some of the fellow community members were a challenge.
We live below Barbara and Neil in the Wilkinson Flats, and there's some stories from that which just don't bear repeating, I think, in polite society. But again, that was part of the experience of living in a community and that community itself was no longer going to be the model. So the shift to Penrose in 1994 becomes a shift to a very different model, a non-residential site with some houses still, but not on site. And then eventually, so that new model, and eventually a new principle, a new context, and the context being a change to the educational structures, NZQA and TEC. The New Zealand government becomes enamoured with the idea of the knowledge economy, as was the wave going right around the world, and so tertiary education was seen to be the answer to everything. And so everyone was positive about tertiary education, and government funding suddenly becomes available, and the college decided to pursue that. But what we ended up with, therefore, was a diploma of mission, Carey only initially, and as well as a University of Auckland Bachelor of Theology delivered through ACTE, and then eventually the Bachelor of Applied Theology in 2001. But that was only 2 programs, but many masters. ACTE itself had to be met with. University of Auckland was a party, NZQA, Tertiary Education Commission, the denomination, the churches, the student bodies. This became quite a stress on the college's life to meet all those needs. And eventually the Bachelor of Theology becomes the centrepiece of the teaching. And Sarah, you became a student during that time. What was your experience?
Yeah, well, I studied in the 2000s, and when we arrived, we were young, passionate about Jesus, and in the thick of youth ministry in West Auckland. I came with a faith that was very real, but built on some kind of dodgy scaffolding, and Carey did not allow that to stand. During my time here, God led me into a deeply uncomfortable process of deconstruction, and it felt less like academic study for me and more like surgery. It was as if God said, while you're in a safe place, I'm going to challenge some of this. So there was unravelling, there was wrestling, there was honest doubt, and I want to say something about that. Carey gave me room to wrestle. The culture here, the quality of the teaching, the seriousness with which questions were taken, created a spaciousness that made that kind of wrestling possible. I vividly remember George Wheeland sharing quite vulnerably about his own season of doubt, and it was deeply validating for me in that painful season. This spacious culture is no small thing, and I don't take it for granted. And through God's mercy, after the dismantling, came reconstruction, a faith that was stronger, deeper, and more grounded. And my lecturers, they taught me how to read scripture with reverence for the author's intent, for their cultural moment. I stopped using the Bible as a pick-me-up and started encountering it as something that could genuinely unsettle me. Luke, with George Whelan, became my favourite class, where Jesus' radical concern for the poor and marginalised broke open my imagination and reorientated everything. And then in 2010, Paul and I and our 2 kids moved to India and co-founded the Loyal Workshop, offering alternative employment to women coming out of the sex trade in Kolkata. 10 years of beauty and suffering, brokenness and transformation. And I can tell you that that work was made possible because of what happened here first. Carey was our launch pad. So to Paul Windsor, Mick Duncan, George Wheeland, Laurie Guy, Derek Christensen, Martin Sutherland, Brian Crum, Mike Hubbets, Charles Hewlett, your passion for Jesus was contagious and it stuck. The Loyal Workshop exists today in no small part because you first invested in us. You know who you are, and I thank God for you.
Now we need to hurry things along a bit because I'm running out of lunchtime. The Diploma of Mission and the Bachelor of Theology took off. They became a very popular course, and for a time, and this is the trajectory of the early 2000s, and they plateaued soon after this, but for a time, Carey was the largest theological program in the country. But those persistent themes need to be returned to. A resistance to academic learning had lessened during this time because of this. The society was convinced that tertiary education was the answer. Regionalism was still an issue, so distance learning began. Resourcing became an interesting challenge because we're now being paid to be a college by the government, and that created its own issue. Ramification was less of an issue because we were able to combine most things into the Bachelor of Applied Theology program, so things were nested within that quite neatly. And the resonance with the churches became much more successful during this period, and I think I give tribute to Paul's work there, that there was a sense of a recovery of the connection to evangelicalism, which people had wondered about in the aftermath of the charismatic tension between the colleges, and that seemed to work very well. Now, in this last period, I've taken the coward's way out of a historian, and recent history is always tricky, so you ask the people to do it for themselves. So I rely on Charles and John's recollections of the key things that have happened during their time for this last part. Leadership change took place again. Paul moved on. Diversification intensifies. The gender balance amongst staff and students gets addressed, which had been a thorny problem for a while, particularly on the staff level, finding a good gender balance. And treaty engagement begins in a much more engaged fashion. The challenge of community, though, how do you, in a meeting place rather than a live-in community, how do you build community still? And so food and worship, lunchtimes and chapel became key to that, and a lot of work was put into making those models work for students who are travelling to the college. Now, in John's time, the diversification becomes different. We're being church, we're being digital, we're living totality. Regionalisation takes place as a core drive from the centre, oddly enough, conversely, perversely. That the regionalisation is made possible by the centre itself with digital communication and digital methods of teaching and so on. And this now is the future of the college. The implications of that, though, become the big challenge. How do you then create any form of community and fellow feeling if everyone's not in the same place, if they're not in the same presence with people, with each other, if they're not smelling each other? Block courses and things like that make a big inway into that, and were quite successful. But the shifting sands of the tertiary context became overwhelming towards the end of the teens and early 20s. And so the change of funding and the demands of government, which is no longer enamoured with tertiary education in the same way as it was, and doesn't want to fund it to the same degree, and there's constant pressure on colleges to reduce their funding, and this college has suffered from that. This is an ongoing resourcing problem. So that question of the £65 for every student per student, we're going to have to readdress that. I think as a denomination we're going to have to face up to the fact that we as a denomination have to fund this college more directly. We've been getting it on the cheap for a long time, and we fund now less than 10% of the college's budget directly. So this is something we need to be aware of. So now we're at Site 6, Te Whare Tōtara. And it's a different college, isn't it? It's way different from Mount Hobson. And even though you can see Mount Hobson, the distance is 1,000 miles. The college still faces these same persistent themes. There is still, in many circles, a resistance to academic learning. Regionalism is being addressed directly now. It's become the norm, that people are prepared to study in their own locations and expected to study in their own locations. Resourcing is a big challenge and will be the big challenge in the next few years. The danger of ramification and the multiplication of foci becomes always present in a college like this. You cannot meet everybody's needs. It's impossible. And the demands of meeting everyone's needs, because everyone's keen to have lecturers and so on present in their regions and so on, and teaching and delivering locally. It's very difficult for an individual staff member to be able to carry that sort of load and to be able to maintain their own research and academic life. The resonance with the churches, again, a challenge. And this is something we need to be alert to. We churches need to listen to the college more. The college will always be slightly out of step with the denomination because it's focused on some different things. But we mustn't let the college get too far from us, and we mustn't let ourselves get too far from this important part of our ministry. Let's make sure that we are adopting our college in a very active way. And an extra R, responding to the Spirit. The college will not be the same as it was. It can't be. But it meets these needs in different ways, and we of former generations of students need to not hold on to the notion that the college will ever be the same as it was when we were there. It mustn't be. It can't be. We are not the same as current students. Current students face different challenges. Our society is very different. And we need to accept that while we celebrate what's been and the fulfilment of a mission in our generations fulfill them in different ways from the previous generations. And it will be done differently by the college to come. And in this place, it'll be a very different Carey from what it has been before. But the place still is an unfolding story. Thank you.
The Baptist NZ Podcast Network.